Good morning, and thank you all for joining Pioneer Forward Thinking Farming webinar. My name is Ken O'Brien. I'm part of the U.S. Agronomy Sciences team and happy to be here today to host this session where we're going to focus on talking about tar spot. And we kind of have a three-part approach to what we're going to do here this morning from an agenda standpoint. We're going to talk about this relatively new to the U.S. disease and talk through its life cycle, what's happening. We've got a pioneer field agronomist from Wisconsin who has been involved with what is happening in tar spot and helping to try to manage that disease. And he's going to share some of his experiences and what we have seen as a pioneer organization. We've got a member of our Corteva crop protection team with us as well to talk about some of the things that we can do to help manage tar spot if it does arrive in your field. So I think it's going to be a great session here this morning. And we also expect that there's going to be a number of questions that come up. So everyone is muted this morning since we've got quite a few participants on the webinar. I encourage you to use the Q&A button that will exist on your chat, on the bar within Zoom here. You should see a button that says Q&A that will allow you to type in a question. I'll be keeping an eye on those and try to make sure that towards the end of the session, we get those directed to the right person and get those answered. So please go ahead and be typing in your questions and we'll keep an eye on those and answer them towards the end of the session. We should have plenty of time for questions. So store those up, get them put into the Q&A and we'll handle those. For anybody who signed up who is a certified crop advisor, when you signed up, you entered your CCA number. At the end of the webinar, for those who are attending and entered your CCA number, we'll submit those to the organization and you'll get credit for attending. Little plug, our next webinar in the Forward Thinking Farming series is going to come up almost exactly a month from now, the first Friday of March, which would be March 3rd. So stay tuned. You'll see the same email invites or social media invites that you saw that got you here to listen about tar spot for that upcoming Forward Thinking Farming webinar on Friday, March the 3rd. And as we get started here this morning, there's going to be a lot of great content that's presented by our experts, but I'm going to start with kind of a summary of the overall message that we're going to talk about with tar spot. And the overall message we're going to talk about with tar spot is that, like a lot of diseases, we need to understand the environment and understand how favorable the environment is for that disease to cause us problems. But even prior to that, knowing that tar spot is coming into more and more areas in the United States, we need to think about the genetics that we're going to be putting into planting, because genetics can have a big play in how we're controlling this. And if we assume tar spot is going to show up in many areas, we need to think about a well-timed fungicide. There's other things like soil nutrition to make sure the plants are already healthy that can have an impact. But you're going to hear us talk an awful lot about choosing good genetics that have some tolerance or resistance, levels of resistance to tar spot. And you're going to hear us talk an awful lot about a well-timed fungicide. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started here this morning. And Scott Hoechlin, who is the Corteva North American Plant Pathology and our Global Phytosanitary Lead, is going to kick things off here this morning, introduce himself a little bit more, but also kick things off teaching us a little bit about tar spot and helping us understand what we're dealing with. So Scott, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ken. So tar spot is a new disease to the United States. It's a fungal disease, and it was already endemic in Central America and Northern South America. And our colleagues in Corteva that are in those areas were already experienced in dealing with it. But it's a new challenge for North America corn breeding because the experience that we had with it in Central America is more with tropical germplasm. And here in North America, we have temperate germplasm. So it takes a little while to work on that temperate germplasm and get to know it well in the presence of this disease, and also have a good plan to increase the resistance to this particular fungal pathogen. So as I mentioned, it was in Central America. In 2015, it was introduced to North America in Northwest Indiana and in Northwest Illinois. There were 2 foci of infection that started in 2015. And from there, it has continued to move throughout the Midwest. At first, we didn't know whether it would even overwinter, being more of a tropical disease with our previous experience, but it overwintered just fine in our harsh winters, and it started spreading. So we knew that it was going to survive and it was going to continue to spread. And so we started to focus on learning as much as we could about this disease here in North America. When you look at the symptoms of tar spot on corn, we get these black stromata that form on the leaves. So basically the spores will go ahead and land on the leaf, infect the leaf, start to colonize some of the tissue. And then a couple weeks later, you'll start to see these black stromata starting to form. And these are the fruiting structures for this fungus. Inside these black raised hard dots that are on the leaf are fungal fruiting structures that release ascospores. Those are released into the wind. They will spread throughout the canopy, continue to infect your leaf tissue, but they will also blow out of the canopy into adjacent fields and can be carried considerable distances on the wind. So again, this disease is wind dispersed and can blow into your field if it's not already been in your field, if it's in adjacent areas. The photo on the right shows a severe infection that's underway. You can see that the leaf tissue, as the stromata start to build on the leaf, we're starting to get more of that sickly gray green instead of the healthy green. And then it starts to turn chlorotic, where it's more yellow-green, and then we have necrotic areas that start to form. And that's the main concern with this disease, is as this colonizes the leaf tissue and turns it necrotic, we no longer have photosynthate that we can put towards filling out that ear for good yield and good test weight. And a good example of what on the left is a leaf that is thoroughly burned up with tar spot. This is no longer contributing anything to yield. And obviously, it's a source of many, many spores that can continue to be moved throughout the canopy. So environment really drives tar spot. So this disease, we learned a lot about it. A lot of these parameters that you see on the screen right now were what we knew about it in Central America. And even though it was a Central America or more of a tropical area disease, where this disease occurred in those areas was more in the highlands, where the temperature is not quite as high. And so tar spot really likes warm, wet conditions, not super hot. But again, if you have average daily temps in that 63 to 72 degree day and high humidity, that's what's really ideal for this, along with prolonged leaf wetness. So when you have those very long dew periods, if you have overhead irrigation that's adding to the leaf wetness, that'll help drive this disease. And when we talk about that average temperature of 63 to 72, remember that's an average temperature. The temperature during the day can easily get up into the 80s. It can get down into the high 50s at night. But as long as you're consistently staying in that range with wet conditions in the canopy, that's what will really drive this disease. Those black stromata form about 2 weeks after that initial infection. So the spore will land on the leaf. It'll begin to infect. About 2 weeks later, we get the black stromata formed. And then anytime after that, up to a week later or so, we'll have spores that are produced and liberated into the canopy. And again, the more you have those wet conditions that keep those stromata damp or wetted, then they'll start to release their spores. So those prolonged warm, wet conditions keep driving this disease. When we hit drought conditions where the canopy really dries up and we don't have that humidity, we don't have that leaf wetness, that slows the disease progression down. So in 2015, when the disease was introduced, again, we knew a lot about this disease and those environmental parameters I just showed you. And so a modeler actually predicted that if this disease does continue to spread from those two foci of infection in the Midwest, where would this disease be a problem? And taking those environmental parameters into effect, they predicted with this map here, this would be where the disease would do the best. And they actually did a pretty darn good job of it. I'll show you some additional maps where we have current spread. I think about the only thing they didn't capture well was how well it does in Michigan because of the lake effect. But in general, you can see here, this is where they predicted they would have the greatest effect. And this is what we knew at 2015 before we really knew anything about this disease here in North America. When you look at the current establishment to date on this map. This map is provided by the Corn iPipe. So this website here, I encourage you to jot this down. It's cornipipe.org. This is a map that is updated weekly throughout the season, and all the university pathologists, any companies like ours that are contributing diagnostic information, are helping every year determine where this disease is occurring. This particular map here is showing where you see all these counties in gray. That this is the extent of the disease. All of these counties have had the disease sometime between 2015 and this last season. So from those initial points of infection in Illinois and Indiana, it has continued to spread, and we've got it clear out east as far as Pennsylvania. It's down in the south in Georgia and Florida. And really, it's continuing to spread. So what we know is that based on these environmental parameters, it's just a matter of time until almost the entire eastern U.S. from the south to the north will have the inoculum, the spores present out there in corn debris. And then it's just a matter of when Mother Nature delivers those ideal conditions as far as those prolonged, warm, wet conditions that will cause this disease to really ramp up in a given season. Looking at this map, zeroing in a little bit, we're not showing that eastern part of Pennsylvania here, but I wanted to show you, this is a good example from this year. So you see areas like here in Iowa, in southern Iowa, there were counties that were gray. That means that in the past it's been there, but in 2022, we didn't see it in those counties, but we did see it in these other counties of Iowa, for instance. And this map is a little bit misleading. It'll be better this coming year, but Illinois actually had tar spot throughout Illinois. The issue here was that the university pathologist at Illinois left for a different position in another state, and there wasn't anybody that was entering the data into the system from Illinois. So you can pretty much in 2022 know that Illinois was all lit up like its surrounding states. Looking at this map, I wanted to point out that in 2018, we had an epiphytotic event in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. Epiphytotic event, I know it's a new word to a lot of you, but it's basically an epidemic that has really severe effect on a particular crop. And this happened because the disease was already in this area. So we had the spores, the inoculum in the area. And in 2018, Mother Nature delivered us the perfect storm for this disease. We ended up with those wet, warm conditions, prolonged wet, warm conditions starting out in early July. So in early July, this disease really kicked up, and it continued to ramp up throughout the growing season because they had flooding, they had prolonged wet conditions in that area all the way from July through early September. And that showed us the true potential of this disease. If Mother Nature delivers you that kind of conditions, this disease can really explode. And if your hybrids are very susceptible to this disease, it can cause very dramatic yield loss. And Scott Roundtree has some pictures showing what that can look like here later in the webinar. So if you look at where we do our corn testing across, or testing across North America, we have testing that goes on all over the Midwest. Everywhere that corn is grown, basically, we have testing through Corteva. And as a result, that gives us a real advantage because we have these test plots everywhere that we have intensive corn production, and it gives us a lot of data on those products. And that type of testing that we have is impact testing. So with impact plots, everywhere that we have these impact plots, we have all of our products, not only products that are commercial products, but products that are in the pipeline, getting very close to commercialization. And we also have some competitor checks in there as well. And the nice thing about it is in a given location like this, every one of those products is in the exact same environment, and we're analyzing them apples to apples. We know the pressure that's in the plot. When we're scoring for tar spot and impact plots, We make sure that we have even disease pressure across the plot and that we have very strong disease pressure. When you have light disease pressure, it doesn't tell you a lot because you really need extreme disease pressure to push those products all the way across the 1 to 9 score range so that you can truly tell the difference between what is a 4 versus a 5. So impact is a real advantage for us when it comes to working with tar spot and understanding our germplasm. So here's where our impact locations are for corn. And you can clearly see, think back about that map, both the maps where in 2015, they predicted where tar spot would be. The actual occurrence I showed you with all those gray counties from the iPipe map. So basically everywhere that we're seeing tar spot on those maps, we already have impact plots, and we've been looking at our germplasm ever since 2015, using these impact plots, really knowing how our products differentiate themselves from each other, so we can tell which of those have the greatest tolerance and which of those are more susceptible. And that really helps us with product placement and advising you on the best products for your particular area. And using those, that's how we come up with the scores that you are seeing in your sales literature. So when it comes to the scores, you can see here, we've got some scores that have a solid number, others that have a double asterisk. So the ones that have the solid number are ones that we have multiple years of data where we're very confident that that is about where their tar spot tolerance is on our 1 to 9 scale. But there was such heavy demand from all of you that wanted to know scores for tar spot, with us being a new disease and wanting to have some clue about how our products are performing against that disease, that we release some of these with a double asterisk. The double asterisk means that we have limited data on them, but those scores may go up a score or down a score in the coming year as we get more data on the product. But at least it's something to guide you on. Is it something that it is more tolerant or more susceptible? And that helps you in making that decision. Once we have enough data on that particular product, we will move it to a solid score that is your best guidance on how that product will perform in your area. And again, the tar spot ratings that we have, if you try to compare them to the competition, there's a real difference there. We are very conservative. You probably already know this with our scores for northern leaf blight, for gray leaf spot. We're very conservative with our scores, and we use the exact same scoring scale that we use in research and development. So that's why with a lot of our products, you'll see scores ranging from mostly from 4s to 7s, but we have a few 3s and 8s in there. The reason we don't have a lot of the 3s and lower our products get weeded out. They're too much of a liability for that particular disease. And so again, we're using that exact same scale that we use in research when we present our sales scores. When it comes to the products that are 8s or 9s, very limited. Maybe some of those have a yield penalty for all that resistance, so they don't make it through the advancement process. So that's why you see most of the scores kind of in that, for the most part, the 4 to 7 range. But at least you know that those scores are real. They're based on research data, and that we're not just putting our highest score on the product that is the best of our portfolio. This really helps you in picking out your products there. And when it comes to the competition, you can't necessarily invert the scale to theirs and have an adequate comparison, because a lot of times we've seen some of the best scores that a competitor puts out there are the best product that they have. It's not rated the same way that we do ours. And if you try to compare them head to head, you'll see that for something that they're putting in the middle of their score range compared to something we put in the middle of our score range, there's a drastic difference in the tolerance that is exhibited. So with that, I'll really roll it over to our next presenter, Scott Roundtree. And Scott was actually in that area where we had the epiphytotic event in 2018. And as a result, he was out there working with the customers, walking the fields, and really getting a good feel for what the potential is of this disease. So Scott?
Great, thank you, Scott. So my name is Scott Roundtree. I'm a pioneer field agronomist in south central Wisconsin, and we've been dealing with tar spot here for the past 5 growing seasons. Somewhere in the state, we were having some level of yield limiting loss due to tar spot. It's just kind of where those rain events set up, like Scott had previously talked. Wherever we get those environments that favor tar spot, we tend to see some pretty significant yield loss year in and year out. So I wanted to start with a story. This was a field day that I hosted in the 2018 growing season in the second week of August. This is in Lafayette County, Wisconsin, very close to Platteville, Wisconsin. So we're about 25 miles northeast of Dubuque, Iowa, off the Mississippi River. Had about 75 growers here this night. As you can see in the background, the 2018 growing season was fantastic. Warm conditions, wet. We had a lot of rainfall, set up for some record yield potential in a lot of fields, as you can see from the photo there. At this field day, I talked corn at my station, talked rootworm, but you can see a few leaves on the table. We talked corn diseases. Gray leaf spot was pretty predominant in the 2018 growing season, so we talked that. Also common rust, eye spot, and then I did have a couple leaves on the table with tar spot on it, and I had first found tar spot in the 2016 growing season in this county. So it had been around for 3 years, but never really developed much. It kind of hung out low in the canopy and never caused yield limiting loss. So I kind of told growers about it, but we weren't concerned about the yield limiting impact of tar spot at that point. But within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, there were a lot of fields in that county that looked like this. So the photo on the left-hand side, it's 240, 250 bushel per acre yield potential ground, went from bright green, healthy corn, extremely high yield potential, to brown and dead within a matter of 7 to 10 days. You can see what impact that has on the grain quality. I compared a lot to a frost event where you immediately kill that plant. You don't have photosynthate going to fill the rest of that grain or the potential that you had originally set, and you're left with shallow kernels and some pretty severe yield impacts. A lot of the yields were off anywhere from 30 to 50+%. A lot of 120 through 150 bushel corn got shelled that year when it should have been more closer to 220 through 250. If you were to ask me about that photo on the right-hand side, I'd probably tell you that's a photo from the month of November. Corn tops broken out, looking to get shelled. But here we were in the last week of August with corn looking like that. Within a couple of weeks, normally we'd be in full silage chopping season here, half milk line, still a ways to go throughout grain fill, but we had some of the most susceptible genetics that looked like this. This is a competitive variety that had undergone that rapid death in about 7 days, and that plant cannibalized all the resources in that plant to try to fill out any remaining potential of yield in those fields. So a lot of combines got going there in the second week of September into some pretty poor yields, high 30+% moisture corn, and it was a really big disappointment, almost a shock and awe effect that we had from this disease. So I'll go through a series of take homes. I know there's some of you on the call today that have probably been dealing with tar spot for 5 seasons, just like we have. And then some of you might have just first seen tar spot in the 2022 growing season. So we wanted to talk about some of the management things and what I see as an agronomist, what we can do as managers to help grow a good corn crop with tar spot around. So probably the first big take home is frequent scouting with this disease is absolutely key. So after the 4th of July holiday is when I usually like to start scouting for tar spot. If the infection came from an inoculum that was already in that field, often it's going to be really down low in that canopy. So hip high on down, I often scout at about knee height in those first few collars of leaves off of the ground. Often it'll appear as just a few black flecks on the leaf. A good way to differentiate between tar spot and insect poop or insect frass is just spit on your finger and rub on that black spot. If it's shiny and it comes off, that's the result of an insect. But tar spot often is a little bit raised and it won't come off the leaf when you spit on it. After you've identified tar spot in your field, be out there aggressively scouting multiple times per week, every 3 to 4 days through about beginning dent or R5. After R5, there's really no opportunity to spray a fungicide anymore, and our ability to manage it in season has gone away. So here's a really nice set of photos taken from our Eastern Iowa pioneer field agronomist Jim LaFrenz out of Jackson County, and you can see the rapid development. This is the same leaf. He took a Sharpie and marked it there in the bottom right corner of the leaf, returned 7 days later, and you can just see the the incredible advancement of this disease in just 7 days under favorable conditions. Now, this is mid-September, but in that 2018 growing season, we were seeing this in mid-August with 30 to 40 days of rainfall left to go in many cases. And then finally, after black layer R6, if you had some pretty significant tar spot in your fields, get out, do the pinch test, and monitor stock quality very closely, because those plants can cannibalize pretty quickly. So one thing we're incorporating lately is we talked about how weather was important in the environment. So our Corteva plant pathology team and researchers have done some modeling as far as the risk of tar spot and some other plant diseases. So we use this as some pretty strong guidance: when to scout, where to scout. You can see not every area is affected evenly based on previous rainfall events. Certain counties might receive 2 to 4 inches of rain, while the county next door doesn't get that event. So this helps guide our decisions of where to scout, where to focus those efforts, and where we're most likely to see tar spot based on accumulated leaf wetness hours, temperatures, and things like that. So here's just some shots from various places across southern Wisconsin over the past 3 growing seasons. Going through these 3 growing seasons, it was pretty evident that tar spot was here to stay, and it was going to be a perennial problem for our corn growers. The 2021 growing season in geographies Madison down to the Illinois state line were very dry. The impacts of tar spot were almost negligible, but you move 50 miles further north where they got 6 to 10 inch more of rain from kind of La Crosse to Green Bay, Wisconsin. Tar spot set in perfectly, and growers up there suffered 50+ bushel yield losses. So again, it really depends on where that rainfall band sets up, how frequent it is, and what the environmental conditions are. Take home number 2 is, as Scott mentioned earlier, tar spot overwinters very successfully in the Northern Corn Belt, and it isn't going away. A day like today where we have below 0 temperatures under the snow, that tar spot inoculum is happy as can be. So this was a study that the land grant pathologists had run in 2019. So out in the spring of the year in 19, they went out to these various fields in the different states you see there on the left-hand side, collected corn tissue that was infected with tar spot, brought those into the lab, and then tried to coax those spores into germinating. And you can see at all 12 of those fields across the various states, they were able to achieve some level of spore germination off of that residue that had overwintered. So that just goes to show that tar spot can overwinter very successfully, and then that inoculum will then be there to infect a following corn crop if grown the next year. Probably one of my favorite photos here is this photo out of the plant pathology group at Michigan State University, Dan Heasley and Marty Chilvers, really showing the importance of leaf wetness and how that impacts this disease. So I'm sure this grower was hoping for some pretty high yields under that irrigator, and you can see the impact of the increased duration of leaf wetness hours and how that canopy desiccated pretty quickly with tar spot compared to the dryland corners on the outside. I will note this field was treated with headline amp, so multiple mode of action fungicide at that VTR1 silking timing. So even in the presence of a good fungicide, if you have a susceptible variety and the right environment, that's 2 components of the disease triangle right there that are met. All right, so take home number 3. I know not a lot of acres of corn in the Northern Corn Belt here are irrigated, but for those of you on the call who are under irrigation, some of the recommendations we have been going, if possible, to irrigate more water at a single event. If you can get another 10 to 3-4 tenths on without having risk of erosion, things like that, turning that irrigator a little bit slower and maybe saving 2 or 3 turns over the course of a growing season, just reducing the overall hours that canopy will be wet over the course of the growing season. That's one of the big things we can do, and you can see again here, a couple of these irrigated shots really highlight the importance of strong hybrid tolerance to tar spot in an irrigated situation. So I'll go on to show quite a few irrigated photos where we can really start to tease some differences out, but most of you on the call are farming dryland acres, but just remember, we go back to 2018, a lot of those 50% yield losses were almost entirely under dryland conditions. So it's not just a disease of irrigated corn, but it's something to manage there. Final note on irrigation, one thing we've also gone to recommending is growers turning their pivots on, going into the nighttime hours, 7, 8 o'clock at night when that dew would already be setting on, maybe water through the next day and the following night when again, we'd already have dew. Try to line up your irrigation events with when those leaves would be naturally wet from dew. Okay, if you take one slide home, emblazon this one into your memory, and this is probably the main take-home point of this entire webinar, is that as a corn grower, it's your responsibility, if you're looking to manage tar spot, to be selecting those highly tolerant genetics. This is an impact plot just outside of Madison, Wisconsin in the 2021 growing season, and you can just see the incredible diversity in tar spot tolerance. This plot was not sprayed with a foliar fungicide to try to bring out those genetic differences. The grower did an extremely good job. He planted a highly tolerant Pioneer Hybrid 0720 around the outside that's rated a 7 on tar spot, and you can see how that compares to the wide variety of different tar spot scores within there. So these are commercial and pre-commercial products in our pipeline, along with some competitive checks as well. But the main take home here is that it's a relatively free decision for you as a grower to be selecting that hybrid with strong tolerance. You know, that product on the outside of that plot might cost the exact same as one on the inside with a score of a 4 or a 5 or a competitive variety that would even have greater susceptibility. So it's a free decision. It doesn't cost more for tolerance in many cases, and you decide what you plant. So talk to your seed seller. They should know how each of their varieties perform in terms of tolerance through genetic tolerance to tar spot. And also get out, walk some local plots. You know, we can show you some pictures here from various areas in Wisconsin, but get out, know what's happening in your local area, which varieties fit best in your geography. And for a lot of growers, behind yield, tar spot tolerance has become probably the #2 selection criteria, particularly for the irrigated grower. They care more about how well does that hybrid hold up to tar spot, even more so than, say, grain dry down or test weight or things like that, just because it can rob, 50, 100 bushels easily if we have the wrong environment. A few more images from 2018 all the way through 2022. So on the left-hand side, that was an image of some corn, Pioneer 105 day that was had some pretty exceptional tolerance to tar spot versus a competitive product. And then a photo from our product agronomist here in southern Wisconsin, Eric Pilley, from one of his impact locations. He advanced this new 104-day product. It'll be our first, at least in our lineup, that's going to have an 8 score, a preliminary score on tar spot. So Pioneer's continuing to advance our tar spot scoring. And then, like Scott said earlier, we call those out of our programs that have really susceptible or low scores for tar spot, and try to continue to raise the bar as we move forward, knowing that tar spot is going to be an annual problem. All right, take home 5. This will be the last take home I have for you, is that you cannot fungicide your way out of tar spot. Recently, we've had some competitors saying that you can plant our fairly susceptible hybrids as long as you spray them once, and even more commonly recently, the recommendation has been to spray those susceptible hybrids twice post-tassel. That becomes very expensive, but here was a great image to show that fungicide is a component of tar spot management, but it's a far second in terms of selecting the right hybrids and genetic tolerance to start with. So here we have a variety of DeKalb hybrids, and then we have some of our leading Pioneer hybrids as well in this PKP plot. This plot was sprayed twice post-tassel with foliar fungicide. So it had Tribapro at R1 brown silk time, and then Veltima roughly 21 days later. Few call outs here. I put the yields below each of those entries. And then we had 720 as a check in the middle, and there was only a bushel of yield variance. So this was an extremely uniform plot, sprayed twice with a fungicide. I averaged each of the brand performance together, and you can see even with 2 foliar fungicide applications, there was still a 30 bushel yield advantage to planting more tolerant Pioneer genetics. So fungicides are a component of tar spot management, but by no means can they make up the deficiencies in hybrid susceptibility. Right, just another image from the 2022 growing season. Here's a hybrid with a 7 score versus a newer competitive product. And when we show these images, sometimes you can see this rapid necrosis. It might only be a 1 or 5 or 10 bushel yield loss compared to a very highly tolerant hybrid. But like we saw in 2018, often that gap can stretch to 50, 75, 100 bushels. So, visuals are nice, but it's also important to measure the yield loss and know the yield impacts of certain varieties. Wanted to show this data set out of Purdue University. So this was a 3-year study, essentially showing what I showed under that irrigated picture a couple slides ago. But they took a non-susceptible variety and then 2 more tolerant varieties to tar spot. One of those was a Pioneer 105-day product. And they sprayed each of those hybrids, and then they also left an untreated control, which are the black hash marks. The treated with a fungicide would be the white bars. So you can see on the susceptible variety there on the left-hand side, we do see a significant reduction in tar spot disease when we spray susceptible genetics with the foliar fungicide. We also see that significant reduction in disease when we spray more tolerant hybrids with a foliar fungicide. Maybe not to the extent that we see in the susceptible, but we still do see a significant level of disease reduction. The main call out here in this slide is that in both those moderately resistant hybrids, even untreated, we have lower levels of tar spot disease in that canopy versus a susceptible variety that has been sprayed. So just really hammering home the importance of hybrid tolerance and how that needs to be a selection criteria as we move forward. Right, probably the most common question I get is when is the best single time to spray? If I'm committed to spraying a one-time fungicide application after silking, when is the best time to do that? Historically in the Corn Belt, I'd say a lot of talk that's dominated the past decade has been that VTR1 timing. So we see that tassel coming out, silks are starting, hit it with a fungicide then. That often had provided the best one-time return. So you can see in a 3-year data set out of Purdue, the lower the bar, essentially the less disease or tar spot pressure is out in that field, with various fungicide timings there across the x-axis on the bottom. So you can see the D represents the lowest disease pressure, and in each of those 3 years, that R2 or blister stage timing was the best time to hit it. Occasionally VT performed quite well. In that 2021 growing season, you see R1 was an A, really high. They actually had a rain event that washed the fungicide product right after they sprayed it, kind of a pop-up shower. So that's the reason there. But if you're looking at a one-time fungicide application, target what that photo looks like there on the right. You want to have those silks browning up nicely, no new silk emergence coming out, and then those blisters starting to form from the successfully pollinated corn crop. That'll protect a decent bit of that grain fill period is really what we're after. So if the plane is pushing you off or can't quite get there when you want to at silking, that generally tends to be a good thing. Even a week later, it is not at all bad when we look at managing tar spot. Okay, my final wrap-up slide before I turn it over to Will from crop protection. Want to focus on selecting those hybrids that are strongly tolerant. It's relatively a free decision to you as a grower. We want to scout beginning in early July and don't let this disease get ahead of us, and then scout as we go toward harvest for stock quality. Fungicides matter, but they aren't as important as strong hybrid tolerance. That's always needs to be the top of our mind when looking to manage this disease. We need to manage our irrigators if we do have corn underwater, but then also for most of you dryland growers on the call, pay attention to the weather and those weather events that are going to mimic what irrigation would provide, where you might have 2 to 3 days of even mist to dewy to rainfall conditions back to back to back. That really drives this disease and promotes it. And then finally, be monitoring our harvest order as we approach black layers. So there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions, but I'll turn it over to Will from crop protection to talk a little bit more about our foliar fungicide products.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. So good morning, everyone. My name is Will Tubbs, and I am a market development specialist for Corteva Crop Protection, currently located in Southern Iowa. And I serve as sort of the technical resource and the agronomic resource for our crop protection teams, as well as a sort of a cross-functional role between our crop protection brands and our seed brands as well. And my experience, both in Iowa and actually previously with a different role in Corteva, also up in Wisconsin, kind of neighboring Scott. So also been around this for a few years. I wanted to focus on, we've talked about the genetics, how we can manage tar spot that way, but what can we do from a fungicide standpoint? What are some of the things that we can apply, and how does that impact our disease tolerance? So to start off here, I wanted to walk through some trials conducted for several years ago in 2020 in southern Wisconsin. So this is a 6-location trial. And what we're trying to evaluate here is, one, what does it look like for different timings of fungicide applications, as well as how does mode of action play into this decision at all? How does that impact our tar spot control and our ability to reduce tar spot severity? So starting in the upper left-hand image of your screen there in the untreated acre, this is, you can kind of note some of those lesions we can see in the upper crop canopy. There's a noticeable loss in that lush green color that we really like to see. But however, we step over into the top row in that center image where we make a single application of approach fungicide at V6. Now this is approach that's going to be a strobilurian type chemistry. So, we think back to our chemistry, our fungicide chemistry classes where we talk about sort of our preventative and our curative action when it comes to these products, with straight approach being essentially more kind of that preventative type of product. But this is, applied this far ahead of tar spot onset in this environment, really didn't make that much of a difference when it comes to a visual standpoint. Maybe a slight yield increase there of just shy of 2 bushel increase. But that single mode of action that early on just didn't seem to make enough of a difference. However, when we step into the top right-hand image, we go with a multiple modes of action product such as Approach Prima. So now we're getting a little bit some of this preventative and curative activity, but we're also making this application closer to the time of infection, where this top right image is an application that took place right at VT. That's where we see a noticeable jump into as well as yield response, as well as some sort of crop injury or crop tolerance there. We don't see the severity quite as severe. So then what we do is we take the next step. We go to the bottom left-hand image and we combine both of those treatments. So a V6 application of a fungicide followed by a VT application of a dual mode of action product. How does that help? Well, to be honest with you, there wasn't that much of a difference between the VT only and the prior to VT application. So what that tells me is we need to be applying closer to the time of infection as we can. If we jump the gun and pull the trigger just a bit too early, kind of like Scott mentioned, waiting another week sometimes isn't always a bad thing. So then we build on this. We go to the next step. The bottom center image on your screen, we're going to look at an application of Approach Prima, a dual mode of action product, followed 21 days later after that application of Veltima, a competitive product from outside of Corteva, but also 2 modes of action, 2 active ingredients in that product as well. So with both applications, we're sort of getting that preventative and curative activity. And again, we're seeing another gradual increase into our visually, how well we're controlling this disease and how well we're delaying the onset and that severity. And again, we also see a noticeable jump in bushels and bushels in the tank at the end of the year. And finally, at the end of this slide here in the bottom right-hand image, we're going to combine all of these. We're going to make that same V6 application. We're going to follow it at VT with 2 modes of action. Then we'll come back 3 weeks later at 21 days after tassel or after VT and make an application of Veltima again. So what this tells me is, yes, there's a slight yield increase or yield response increase, and maybe some improvements as far as reducing tar spot severity when we made these 3 applications. But something to keep in mind is how economical was this? Did that extra fungicide and that extra pass, did that prove to be an economical return on your investment? Or could we have just stayed to maybe a 2 post-tassel application fungicide in general? However, the other thing to keep in mind, as we mentioned, is planting some of these more tolerant genetics with some higher resistance ratings or tolerance ratings may be able to potentially, maybe it can save us some of those a second pass or a third pass on those more severe years. But it's all a systems approach that we need to take to tar spot management. So walking into some external data, some third-party data, this is a study conducted and collected by multiple Midwest universities over 2 years and multiple sites. And essentially, we kind of want to build the story just like we did last time. So at first here, we're going to look in the left-hand graphic, and essentially we're trying to compare tar spot severity relative to how many modes of action were treated or were put onto these treatment areas. And yes, we see some noticeable improvement and some statistically significant improvement that jump out at us once we apply any fungicide. However, whether it's a 2 mode of action fungicide or if it's a 3 mode of action, we don't see a whole lot of differentiation there. Both of these multi-mode of action giving us some of that preventative and curative seem to be the best option. But at the end of the day, we really care about bushels. So moving on to the right-hand side of this screen, we're going to look at, again, the same comparison of a non-treated versus a single mode of action and a 2 mode of action, as well as a 3 mode of action. And again, this 2 mode of action fungicide did not separate from the 3 modes. So that tells me, go through, work with your input supplier and say, hey, what do we have available? I want multiple modes of action. I'm trained as a weed scientist. I always want to go after weeds with multiple modes of action. I want to do the same thing with these fungicides and diseases. We always want as many modes of action out there as possible to be effective, and always more than one mode of action. Stepping into another trial conducted in Indiana out of Purdue University. So this is, you may have seen this graphic before. This has been out there for a while, but really want to look at, so, we think back to that original slide where we talked about some V6 applications to control tar spot. Maybe that was a bit too early. So this is kind of trying to reiterate that point with this graphic here. In this study, the tar spot was first detected there on July 28th. And they started making their fungicide applications at VT in that first week of August through the next few weeks and into September. And you'll notice as we're looking at this data set, so on the y-axis there, we're looking at the tar spot severity, right? And then on the bottom, we're looking as time progresses, and we see that there's a noticeable jump later in the season when the severity really ramps up relative to when it was first detected. So, we think back to some of Scott's management tips. Yes, if we see some lesions out there, that doesn't mean, hey, we got to be out there right now. Let's hold this off as long as we can. Maybe we wait another week. Let's evaluate. Let's continue to scout as proactively as we can to notice when this is about to ramp up, because these fungicides, no matter what product it is, nothing will give us season-long protection. So let's try to maximize that pass that fungicide application as best that we possibly can. And, kind of like Scott mentioned, we're scouting that through R5. Once we get to that mid-September timeframe in most geographies, and that R5 timeframe when that crop is pretty well made, and our ability to make some of those management decisions isn't really on the table anymore. We want to take a proactive approach using multiple modes of action of fungicide on those acres. So this is a similar study conducted at multiple universities. I get a lot of questions of, okay, so if we're going to use a fungicide, well, which one is the best? What are we going to use? And by and large, I'll just kind of say it now, there is no silver bullet today on the market from any single fungicide. There are certainly some that seem to indicate stronger results than others, but really there's no silver bullet that says if you spray this product, it will get rid of any tar spot. That situation just doesn't exist for us. But really what we see here, once we get into this data set, is we're looking at tar spot severity. Again, there's a pretty large grouping here. All these data bars that you're looking at, if they contain the same letter, that means they're not statistically different when they come to controlling tar spot in this study. So we see a group of 6 products here. And the thing that I would point out would be, of these 6 products, 5 of them are multiple modes of action, or at least 2 modes of action. So again, going back to, if we're going to use a fungicide, let's use multiple effective modes of action to try to, hedge our bets a little bit and get some preventative and curative action out there. And then to expand on that, so I know that was a sort of fairly limited selection of some of these fungicides on the market. So here we're going to introduce a few more. We're going to expand our footprint. This is another one of those same studies across Midwestern universities, looking at tar spot performance and how well these different products controlled tar spot with a fungicide application. And we see another large grouping of these products at the top who really don't separate all that much. But again, there's another common theme with the exception of one of these products. They're all multiple modes of action. There's all at least 2 modes of action in each of these fungicides. So this is where I would encourage you to reach out to your retailer input supplier, just have that discussion of what am I actually getting? How many modes of action am I getting with this fungicide? And will it actually perform the way I want it to? And then more importantly, how best can we time this application to maximize the efficacy of that product? And of course, we also need to consider, if we are in a severe year, what does that ROI conversation look like when we're looking at these various products? So this is just a study conducted from our own internal data from pioneer trials conducted over the last decade. We have over 2,000 locations looking at this and really just trying to determine the ROI and the break even of our cost of these fungicide applications. So at this time, when you're having these discussions with your retailer, it's best to plan ahead, work with your supplier. What can we get on the books so we know our cost of application, so we can kind of plan for this and keep that in mind as we're scouting. And just keep in mind, if you have your corn sold already, take that back into consideration. What is your break even? How will that shake out with your bushels to break even from a fungicide standpoint? Do we need to make 2 passes of fungicide? Will it even pay? Again, kind of back to Scott's point, there's one of those sort of free management decisions is to kind of select our best possible genetics to kind of work in our favor. So hopefully we can minimize our reliance on some of these fungicide applications moving forward. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Ken O'Brien to lead some of our question and answers.
Scott, and Will, first off, thank you. Great job of walking us through tar spot and what we've seen and what we're experiencing. Not surprising to me. There's quite a few questions sitting in our Q&A, and so we'll start working through those. But audience, if you have additional questions, please go ahead and type those in there. And I may kind of bounce around a little bit, but Will, there was one that came in that I'm going to direct towards you because it just came in towards the end here when you were walking through some of the trials from the universities. Do you know, were those trials conducted with susceptible hybrids, somewhat tolerant hybrids, or do we not know? I didn't see anything in the text, but I didn't know if you knew.
So looking into some of these trials, I mean, obviously they're third party. I wasn't necessarily involved in these. Some of them do have the hybrids listed that they were testing. And the only way to know that, if those hybrids, if we can go back to that seed supplier and look at, do they have a tar spot rating? Are they even looking at that? That would be a question for them. That specific hybrid that was used in one of those studies, I'm not familiar with that hybrid enough to know whether it's, an above average or below average. At this time, I'd say I really don't have a great answer for that, but go back and look at the studies and then follow up with the seed companies if you are knowing someone within that company who can get you an answer.
Okay, thanks, Will. And maybe another one that either you or Scott Roundtree, someone asked a question that said, hey, with some of the other diseases, we have some recommended economic thresholds or rule of thumb of, hey, when you see X, it's time to go make an application. So if you see 2 lesions on any leaf above or below the ear, it's time to go make an application for GLS. Do we have any sort of a rule of thumb yet on tar spot for something like that?
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, to me, it's a little bit more of an art and a science to evaluate through routine scouting how rapidly, where in the canopy it is. If it's below the ear leaf, I don't get overly excited about get out there and spray right now kind of thing. But as we move up, and then often as we get later on in the season, if we have an adjacent field that's maybe donating a lot of inoculum, you'll never find it down low. It'll move in, like Scott had talked about earlier, and move with the prevailing winds. So there it can get ahead of you pretty quick. But the thing I like to look for is, are those halos starting to form around that black stroma or stromata? Once that happens, very quickly, you're going to see rapid disease advancement. So I don't, maybe Scott H has a better idea of exact percentage of leaf area coverage, but I do not.
No, I don't think percentage of leaf area coverage is that good a guide. What we really need to look at is, what is the weather going to be like in the next week to 10 days or so. And so if you're seeing it start to move pretty close to the ear leaf, then we need to increase the frequency of the scouting, but also be looking at the weather forecast, because as you mentioned earlier, if you go on with a spray just because you're seeing some lesions there and you have a dry period coming, that's going to start ticking down on those 3 weeks of efficacy or so that you have with that fungicide product. And then if we get a wet, warm period later, you're going to need to go in with another fungicide spray. So it's really about frequent scouting, as Scott Roundtree was telling us there, and really watching what the weather forecast is. If it's getting up around the ear leaf and we have wet weather predicted to come along, and especially where we have frequent rainfall, a period there, then yeah, definitely get in there and get that fungicide spray on at that point.
And I'll jump in for a second, and then I'll probably come right back to you there, Scott. But we still have questions coming in, and that's great. So just for those of you who are here and looking at your watch maybe and saying, hey, we're at 8:26, what are the chances they're going to get to my question? If anybody has to go, please feel free to drop, and you can watch a recording later. But I think the presentation group can stay a little longer than the planned time of when we were going to end. And so we'll try to work through everybody's questions as best we can. I think this next question is related to what we were just talking about, but it's a little bit of a different twist. And that is because of the latency period between when infection happens and when we start to see the disease, the symptomology. Is there any risk there that we already have a lot of infection and the plant's getting ready to have a lot of problems and we can't even see anything yet and the damage is already done and there's nothing we can do about it?
So yeah, I mean, when it comes to latent period with a disease like this, your first clue that the disease is present, that it's active, is when you start to see infection as far as what you can see walking through the field. So, you're somewhat at the mercy of when those symptoms show up, but at the same time, we are developing models that are looking at spore release and how that correlates with the right environment for those spores to actually be able to germinate and infect leaf tissue. So as we're continuing to perfect those prediction models, you'll be seeing those coming out soon that'll help you understand if you do have, let's say for instance, you have a corn on corn field, you had tar spot in your field last year or around the area in adjacent fields, you know that you've got the inoculum there. By keying into that environment that's ideal for infection, the models will start to tell you to scout, and with a little bit of intuition as well. If you know that you've got plenty of inoculum there and you've had some prolonged wet periods in late June, early July, get out there and start looking, see if you can see those initial infections. That'll be your cue that the disease is up and running in your field. And then again, really looking at that longer range forecast. If you see some initial lesions and you've got a dry period coming, hold back, continue to monitor how that disease is starting to ramp up before you jump to fungicide sprays.
Okay. I'm going to pivot us a little bit, but we'll get back to a lot of other questions as well. 2 or 3 different questions around, since this is going to overwinter on the residue, does residue management help at all?
I could take that one. In that study I had showed where they sprayed fungicide on susceptible and resistant genetics, there was also a component of that where they did some tillage versus no-till situations. There was a significant reduction in tar spot in that situation where they did till. However, to me, that's a very small thing when we're looking at tar spot management. In 2018, we had first-year cornfields on soybean stubble, alfalfa that got hit equally as bad when we had that sort of movement of spores all across the countryside. So yes, it can help, but I wouldn't compromise, soil quality or erosion. That southwest corner of the state of Wisconsin is the driftless, non-glaciated. You're talking 5 to 15% slopes, and it just doesn't make sense to work slopes like that to try to get a few points of improvement. Focus on good hybrids first.
Yeah, I agree with Scott's comment there, and also it's sort of you've got the trifecta with the best management when you go with genetics, fungicide sprays, and rotation and tillage. Rotation and tillage is going to have the smallest effect, but really the more of a synergistic effect you get with using all 3 of them effectively, it's going to give you your best result.
How about fertility? Is a healthy plant going to make much difference? There's a couple of questions about that.
Yes, when it comes to diseases in general, the healthier the plant, the better it's going to be able to resist that disease based on its given amount of resistance. When you stress plants greatly, it really challenges that resistance that they have.
Scott, maybe into the Wayback Machine here about why did this disease that we've known about for 100 years all of a sudden show up in the United States and start spreading as fast as it is? What changed?
It was endemic in Central America and northern South America, and it was perfectly fine there. It wasn't here in North America, but around 2015, nobody knows for sure how it got here, but around 2015, we did have a major hurricane event that moved across the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And during those events, there's very strong updrafts that will pull spores from diseases up into the storm cloud. And then it moved right on up and across the central US. And when you look at where the precipitation events occurred as that storm system weakened and then moved into the US, it lines up pretty well with where we saw some of those foci of infection. Some others have suggested that maybe there was some corn leaves or debris, like some of the husks that were used for some of the brooms and for little dolls that they make and people move. But I think the most probable one is the hurricane movement.
Okay. And I'm going to try to put a few questions together into one for you here, Scott, and it's related to scoring of our hybrid products in general. And I would say there's a handful of questions. The first one being there's some products that don't have a score and some that do. Can you address why some products don't have a score?
Yes. So when you look at where tar spot is occurring, we can go back to that map that had all of the counties that you saw that where tar spot was present. As I mentioned in my part of the segment here, that you really need strong disease pressure to fully spread out those products on the 1 to 9 score. And for us to really be able to tell you that something is a 4 versus a 5, for instance, we need that strong disease pressure. So even though in some of those more northern, the shorter CRMs and more southern, longer CRM areas, tar spot was present, if we didn't get very much pressure in the field, if the pressure was light, we're not going to use that score for you because it's not actually predictive of what it's going to do if we get a very strong tar spot. So as I mentioned, we're conservative in our scores. We're not going to mislead you as customers. But if we have enough data, then we will release the scores. And so where you see the scores now ranging mainly from about 100 CRM up to about 108 CRM, that is where we've had the most consistent pressure and the strongest pressure with tar spot to date. And that's where we're confident in those scores. We do have some preliminary scores on material that are in the shorter CRM and longer CRM areas. But until we see stronger disease pressure in that area, not just showing up in the field, but actually where we have significant disease pressure, that's what's going to tell us what the true tolerance of that product is. And we're not going to put a score on it until we feel confident about that. We really don't want to mislead you. We want you to have the right information for product placement.
Thanks. And maybe one more that's somewhat related to that. Are we learning enough about the backgrounds of our products to be able to predict what score we think a new product would have and be close, Scott? Or are we having to wait until we can see it happen, right? Are we finding any markers? Are we finding anything that's helping us predict how our product would perform?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we have as much scoring of our products since 2015 with the impact plots, we know our genetics, we know those hybrid products, and we know the inbred products that make those hybrid products. And so we're able to very well predict our inbreds that are contributing to that resistance or contributing to a little more susceptibility. And so, yeah, we're getting really good leads on the inbred parents. And then in those inbred parents, we're able to identify what is contributing in their genetic makeup to that tolerance. And that's going to, right now, it's really a matter of choosing the best things that are in the pipeline with the extensive screening that we're doing with the impact plots. But right now, at the same time, we're looking at those products that are just going to start moving into the pipeline and assuring that they have the right resistance based on their inbred parentage.
Back to a fungicide application question. Is there a growth stage where it's too late to make an application? So let's say, for instance, you've already made one application, but conditions are still good for infection and spread, and you're 3 weeks after your initial application. At what point in time is the second application not worthwhile?
So, from all of the third-party trials and our internal data sets as well, like Scott mentioned, that R5 timeframe is generally that point where we say, hey, at this point, the crop is pretty much baked. Whatever we can do now, don't know how much of an impact it will really have. The other thing to keep in mind there would be, as you are making a fungicide application, if you have made the first application and you're looking to follow that up, you need to keep your pre-harvest intervals in mind. Those vary to a certain degree from product to product. It's not a one size fits all. So whether you're a silage grower, you're going to chop that for feed, you need to keep that in mind ahead of chopping. We looked at that calendar where September timeframe is about when that really starts to ramp up, and when, hey, maybe then we could see this disease blow up. But we're also generally in that silage harvest timeframe as well. It's a grain harvest, maybe it's a little bit different discussion, but once we get to those later R stages is probably about when that occurs, but depending on environment, severity, and a few other factors, those would all kind of factor into that discussion.
And related, Will, on some of the data you showed there in terms of yield impact of 1 or 2 applications of fungicide, any differences in moisture that people saw in those trials, or are you aware of that?
So I'm not aware of any exact differences between the moisture percentages as they came out in those trials. That would be something that, if the Crop Protection Network is where a lot of those resources came from, and they have some phenomenal resources, and really they've kind of set the standard of what is out there as far as information in Midwest row crops and corn production and tar spot. So I would encourage you either reach out to some of those folks and follow up with some of those resources. There may be some of that located in there, but in the data sets that we showed today, there really wasn't much to speak on as far as true grain moisture at harvest.
Okay. Scott Hoyklund, do we know how long these spores are viable in the soil? And maybe related to that, do we have any molecular markers for the pathogen itself? Are we tracking races? Are we understanding what's happening with the pathogen?
Sure. So with ascospores, they are the most ephemeral of the spore types compared to some Canidia. But what we have to keep in mind here is that those ascospores are embedded in those black stromata, and those black stromata are very, very protective. They're resistant to UV. They protect the spores very well within. So even if that residue is maybe in soil contact, but not well degraded, the following season when the right conditions occur with moisture and temperature, ascospores can be released, and that's how the disease gets started each year, is from the debris from the previous season. The more you bury that residue, the longer it is in contact with the soil and the soil microorganisms, it will degrade, and those ascospores will lose viability and be consumed by microorganisms. So that's where the tillage helps there. But as we talked about before, tillage isn't everything, because even if you do deep tillage on that particular field, there's nothing stopping spores from blowing into your field from adjacent fields. And on the knowing about the pathogen, there's been quite a bit of work done on the genetics of the pathogen. Right now, there appears to be just very little difference in it. There are two different isolates that are out there, one from the Caribbean and one that they track to the Yucatan Peninsula. And there is a very minor difference between the two of them. It does not indicate that one of them is more virulent than the other. So in general, what we're experiencing all across the Corn Belt is a pretty uniform population of this pathogen.
And a couple of semi-related questions. Are there alternative hosts? So beyond corn, is this going to impact soybeans and overwinter there? Are there other grass crops that it's going to be on, or weeds, or anything else that it could be overwintering on and impacting?
Right now, it appears to be pretty much centered on corn. Clearly, there are similar species that can affect grasses, but right now it really looks like corn is the primary host and the one that's going to make the biggest difference here. When it comes to dicots, like alternate rotating crops like soybean, soybean is not a host. This disease only affects things that are in the Gramineaceae, the grasses, and corn is a grass. So basically, corn is your primary source of inoculum, and when it comes to overwintering, going year to year, it's the debris from cornfields.
Is there anything that could be applied to the residue before tillage, or just applied to the residue that would impact that overwintering?
Don't know for sure because no studies that I'm aware of has been done on that. But obviously, fungicides, when applied, would possibly when the spores are released from the stromata, a fungicide is not really going to be able to penetrate that stromata very well. And so once they're liberated, they're free of the fungicide. And if anything, the fungicide sprayed onto debris might actually slow down the deterioration by soil microorganisms and fungi in the soil. So I really don't have a solid answer for that.
There's a question here about through the granular system, Corteva is rolling out a model to predict the timing of fungicide application. And is tar spot included in that model, and will it be included in the future? And I can address that one because I'm familiar with that particular product. For the pilot or initial launch we're doing here in 2023, tar spot is not included in the fungicide timing model that's being rolled out. But the agronomy sciences team, the team that I work with pretty closely, is doing some work in 23 to try to be able to incorporate tar spot into that model in the future. So for 23, that model would deal with gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight. We're trying to work on some tar spot information here in the 23 year so that we could add that in the future. So won't be there in 23, but we're working on trying to get it there for the future. Okay. Any difference expected in tar spot onset or damage as we move further north? Should our teams in Minnesota and Wisconsin or Illinois and those northern areas expect the same damage if the disease gets there at the same time as it does in the south?
I would say as you move further north, you're gonna you'll still get the disease, but it might occur a little later in the growing period just because you need those consistent warm, wet conditions. And obviously, as you go further north, you're going to have more cool average temperatures. So you will get into the range of temperatures that are conducive, but it might be a little bit later in the growing season. So we would expect tar spot to have a limit as far as how far north we see it, and also how far north it can have severe effects.
Okay. Couple of questions related to tar spot and livestock. So if I'm chopping silage of plants that have tar spot and feeding that silage, or if I'm taking stalk bales, using them as bedding and then respreading them back onto fields, am I going to be moving those spores around and potentially moving it to new areas that it wasn't already at?
The answer to that would be yes, especially if you're moving stover. You're definitely going to do that. When it comes to moving through the animal's digestive tract, we did a lot of work with that, with head smut and some other diseases where the spores are extremely resilient and they could survive. In this case, we don't. The stromata are pretty resilient as well, but we have no idea at this point how well they would survive an animal's digestive tract like that. But clearly, with the stover, you can move it.
Yeah, and you all are the experts and I'm the MC here, but I would also assume that unless you're moving that stover a long ways, it's probably already in those other fields as well. If it was in one field, it's most likely in the area, and the potential is probably there.
Yep.
Correct. That was a comment I was going to make. Ever since the 2019 growing season, in the month of October before harvest, I can find tar spot in every single field of corn. Doesn't matter the hybrid, where it is in the state. I can find it in every single field. The severity might be significantly different, but you can find it everywhere. So yeah, unless it's to a brand new area, it's fairly irrelevant.
Any advice on irrigation, team? Do we change our irrigation patterns at all to try to reduce leaf wetness, or anything that can be done there?
Yeah, I touched on that briefly. I think that the fewer times you can irrigate and the more water you can put on at a single time, the better. And then irrigate at night when possible, to irrigate when that leaf would already be wet from dew.
Thanks, Scott. And how about scouting? Is there any areas in the field that would be more susceptible or more likely for me to find it sooner?
Like river bottom areas or lower areas where that fog or dew might set in earlier in the night and then not burn off till later in the morning. That's definitely where you'd want to scout first. I avoid scouting anywhere in the headlands or along grassy waterways. Often that's where you have your insect pressure that maybe could confuse a grower and agronomist on, insect frass being tar spots. So get off the headlands a ways, get into the field and
when we do have the genetic resistance or tolerance, we've kind of used those words interchangeably and they're a little bit different, but when we do have that, what's it doing to stop the infestation?
It depends. There's a lot of different things that are going into the genetics there. In some cases, we're still looking into that. Some of it might be type 1 resistance, where they're actually preventing the infection in the first place, but much more likely it's type 2 resistance that is preventing, once an infection starts to spread within the leaf, it's really slowing down the ability of that fungus to infect and pull up the nutrients it needs to produce the stromata for sporulation. So it's probably a lot of type 2 type resistance.
Okay. Have we seen any studies about impact of rotation on the severity? Scott, I know you mentioned, hey, that we can do crop rotation and tillage, and that has a small impact, but any studies on corn versus rotated fields in terms of what impact that has?
I can't comment on the research. I haven't seen anything that's extremely definitive, but maybe Scott H.
Yeah, the corn disease working group, a grouping of university pathologists have looked at that a little bit, both rotation and tillage, and they saw a very, very small effect, almost insignificant, because of ascospores blowing in from surrounding fields. So much like with tillage, it's not going to be the total answer. It's not going to have a major effect, but it will help along with tillage. But your greatest effect is going to be host genetics and fungicides.
There's a question that came in that says there's some industry chatter that Corteva genetics are requiring some tar spot tolerance from seed treatment. That was a new one for me, and so I don't know if I have any answer that I can provide there.
Right. There's a lot of speculation and coffee talk out there. And that's one that I can tell you, the tolerance that we have is based on the genetics of that particular hybrid line. I'm not aware of any studies that have shown anything with seed treatments having any effect on that.
Will, I know you had some information on efficacy of different fungicides. We've got a question about how we feel about approach premia against tar spot.
So I feel very confident with approach prima and tar spot. I mean, I really do. Looking back to some of that data set, the separation of the 2 modes of action versus the 3 modes of action, there really wasn't much separation at all, and not really that significant. So it's a treatment that we've certainly recommended, and seen some very, very consistent, pretty solid results from approach prima across the board when we've used it. And we have that 6.8 ounce use rate with approach prima, but we also have the opportunity, we're limited on some of the active ingredients in that, but we can outspike in some straight approach. That's been a very common treatment for some of our customers that we've been seeing going out there, and they've had some phenomenal results with that. Yeah, certainly an excellent option.
Okay. There's a question that's coming in about, since this thing has existed in parts of Mexico for a while now, anything we can learn from their management that we haven't talked about here today? Are they doing anything different to manage the disease there?
In Mexico, they're actually dealing with a complex. There's another fungus that actually moves in and causes much more severe disease there. But the principles that we've discussed in this webinar are the same ones that they use, as far as, the same things that will cause the disease to explode there causes the disease to explode here, as far as the weather and environmental parameters. But we have some knowledge, again, from their genetics, and we're applying that to the temperate germplasm, but it's not a direct comparison, because again, that is tropical germplasm, but we are aware of some of the genes that are in that germplasm and looking for those in our temperate germplasm as well.
Great. And then any research on plant height, plant density, leaf orientation, and how that may impact disease severity?
Clearly, anytime that you have a denser canopy, that's going to enhance disease. So higher populations, denser canopy is going to limit airflow through there, and it's going to give you longer dew periods, more leaf wetness, and also leaf orientation. The more vertically oriented the leaves are, the dew will run off those leaves quicker than if they're more horizontally located. The ones that are more horizontal may hold that dew on the center part of the leaf longer and allow for infection in that part of the leaf to get the disease cycle going.
Okay, a couple of questions left. So audience members, thanks for hanging on with us here. I hope you're really valuing us taking some time to answer these last questions. But we've got a question here that is basically asking the differences in scores that we have for resistance to tar spot. Is there any quantifiable difference in what that means for yield? We showed a slide there that said, hey, as there is a difference, and that genetic tolerance does matter. Fungicide matters, genetic tolerance matters. That's what we've been saying, right? It's pick a good hybrid with good genetic tolerance, and well-timed fungicide is a great way to try to manage this disease. But I don't think there's enough data yet that I have seen that would quantify a score of 4 versus a score of 6 means you'll see a 40% less yield loss when tar spot hits. Is anybody aware of anything that's quantified that yet?
No, I'm not. And actually what you're dealing with there is you got two different scores, a 4 and a 6. So you get two different hybrids. They have different genetics. They're going to respond differently, not only in their tolerance to the pathogen, but their yield potential. So that would take a very, very controlled study to be able to do. And we really haven't looked at that.
Okay. And one last question. So from the time that we have infection, we have the latency period, and then eventually we start to see the black spots. Are there earlier symptoms that somebody could look for when they're scouting that prior to seeing the black spots, you can see tar spots starting to set into the plant?
That's going to be hard. You might see a little bit of discoloration of lighter gray, green, unhealthy color right where the stromata is going to develop. But at the same time, some of the genetics that we have, and everybody across the industry has a little bit of tropical germplasm in it that causes some leaf flecking. So it would be very difficult to determine the difference between that and leaf flecking, which it comes from some of the tropical germplasm introgressions.
Great. So that's the questions that we had come in. And number one, thank you, panelists, for your time, for answering all of those questions. I found it very informative, and I hope that our attendees did as well. As we kind of wrap, I think we've had a great discussion here. And so walk away with some key things: that genetics matter. Picking a hybrid with good tolerance to tar spot is a really critical thing for you to think about when you're selecting products if you're in an area that has experienced tar spot and you expect it to be back again the following year. And a really well-timed fungicide goes along with that when tar spot starts to arrive and you start to see the environment be ripe for that to happen. So thank you all for your attendance, for participating this morning. Keep your eyes out for that March 3rd Forward Thinking Farming webinar invite, because we would love to have you all back then. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful Friday.